The Dirt with me, Mike Howell, an economics podcast where I present the down and dirty agronomic science to help grow crops and bottom lines. Inspired by economics.com, farming's go-to informational resource, I'm here to break down the latest crop nutrition research, news, and issues, helping farmers make better business decisions through actionable insights. Let's dig in. Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome back to The Dirt. Things are a little bit different today. We are actually in studio for the very first time. We're not trying to record this from my office or with a handheld microphone. We're here in Fargo, North Dakota. We've got a few events going on this week, and we decided we'd get in the studio and try to add some video with this. Now, this is something we're going to try to do when we're recording in our home office as well. We're trying to get all of that set up, so stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be able to bring you some video with some of these a little later on. Today, we're happy to have Dr. Karl Wyant with us. Karl's been on The Dirt several times. It has been a while, though, Karl. Welcome back to The Dirt.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for bringing me into the studio. I feel like a real pro now.
Well, I don't know if I feel like a pro or not. There's buttons and knobs and cameras and lights all over the place. All of this soundproof stuff on the walls. I kind of feel a little trapped in here this morning, but we'll see if we can get it all figured out. They've already told me don't touch any buttons, so we'll keep our hands to ourselves and see how this works. So, Karl, I know we've got a lot of stuff to talk about this morning. Let's start off and talk about the current crop conditions. I know we both travel a lot and see crops all around the country and even in Canada. So tell us where you've been lately and what the crops are looking like.
So it's been a busy spring, lots of variation in folks' cropping experience. Had a great plant for corn and soybeans. Soybeans went in at a record pace. But we've had some trouble here. We've had a drought for the last 3 years. Significant improvement nationally and in Canada in drought conditions, but we've still got some spots that are just a little hungover from drought, dry soils, some challenges with the winter wheat crop, particularly in Kansas and Oklahoma. And then we've also had some areas that have gotten a little too much rain recently. For example, Texas Panhandle got 20 inches of rain here in the last few days. That's a lot of rainfall.
A lot of rain.
A little too much, maybe. And then we've got some dry soil setting up across the Midwest, which made it so that planting could get done. But now that the crop's in the ground, we've got to make sure that we meet those moisture needs early. And I've had some reports from growers having to plant a little bit deeper in the soil, find that subsoil moisture, and get the crop up. If you go north to Canada, we kind of have a have and have not situation on the Alberta side, very dry, lots of dry soils and wildfires, of course. But as you make your way east into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it gets much greener and a little more soil moisture to work with, and you've got a crop that's rapidly emerging and coming up.
Yeah, well, I was traveling through the Mississippi Delta in Mississippi and Arkansas last week, and the corn is already tasseling. It's looking great, but I don't think I passed a field that didn't have the irrigation running. They had been about 15 days without a rain at that point, and this is the critical stage for that corn. And I heard reports later in the week that soybeans are starting to get irrigated as well, and that's a little early on those beans. We like to hold off until they go into the reproductive stage, right. But it was just it's to the point they had to start irrigating. And heard on the news this morning. It's going to be a hot, dry summer across the entire Southeast. So looks like things are just getting set up. It's funny, we talk about hot and dry, and you're from Arizona, I'm from South Mississippi, and I thought it was rather comfortable outside this morning. Everybody around here is talking about how hot it is in Fargo, but
that's right.
I tell you, 90 degrees in Fargo is not 90 degrees in South Mississippi. So.
That's right. It was 107 in Phoenix when I left the other day, and very dry as well. So it's a dry heat, as everyone always likes to remind me.
Yeah. So is an oven.
So is an oven. Yes, it was right. So is a hairdryer.
Karl, we're here in Fargo, North Dakota this week. We've got several events going on, but I hear you've been invited to come speak at a conference here. Tell us a little bit about the conference you were speaking at in North Dakota and what you told the group.
That's right. The Cultivate Conference is a gathering of innovation and ag technology, and the talk that I've been asked to give is a sort of a TED Talk style. If you watch those on YouTube or podcasts, and I spoke about the need for sulfur and finding the right sulfur formulation for your field, if you follow the ag media and ag media articles, you'll see a lot more news about sulfur nutrition that's come out in the last, I'd say, 90 days. And even if you go back a few years, and just a lot more focus on getting the sulfur fertilizer right on your crop. And there's lots of great reasons why we need sulfur. And that's what we chatted about during the TED Talk.
Carl, I think this is going to be the fourth episode of the Dirt that we focused on sulfur this year. That seems like an awful lot to me. And I've been asked to do other talks about sulfur as well. Why are we getting all the emphasis on sulfur here in the last couple of years, and specifically this year?
At a macro level, we're seeing more sulfur deficiencies than we ever have before. The same fields 5 years ago, weren't showing sulfur deficiencies, which is generally that yellowing of the top of the crop, whether it's corn, soybeans, and alfalfa, things like that. So we're seeing more deficiencies, and really, what at the heart of it is something that happened 53 years ago, believe it or not, and that was President Nixon signing the Clean Air Act, December 31st, 1970, and so the Clean Air Act was introduced, lots of regulations, and the goal was to how do we grow our economy without driving externalities like air pollution. So the Clean Air Act has been a wild success. We've grown our GDP since 1970 by 64%, and we've also reduced 6 major air pollutants by 41%. So we're kind of rebalancing and restructuring, and it's been a wild success. But one of the sort of unintended consequences is we've lost some of the free sulfur that came from industrial activity and was deposited onto the crop. We've lost that sulfur. For example, if you measured in 1990, depending on where you were in the United States, typically in the eastern side of the United States, you were getting up to 27 pounds an acre of free sulfate just coming from the air. And now, a recent measure from 2015, that's dropped to 13 pounds an acre. So almost chopped that free sulfate in half. So we've had that input, the free stuff in the air has gone away. And then, if you kind of do your budgeting from a sulfur nutrition perspective, our yields are higher. We're producing 53 more bushel an acre corn than we were in 1990, and we're pulling, almost 34% more sulfate out of the soil with the crop.
So we've cut our amount of sulfur that we're getting free in half, and we've doubled crop yields. So that's going to necessitate some fertilizer applications of sulfur.
That's right. And right in the middle of that, the input reduction in the sulfur inputs, increase in the sulfur outputs, you have that soil and that the organic matter that contains sulfur. And so we've also seen with erosion and some other decreases in soil organic matter, less just stored sulfur in the soil as well. So it's the whole budget's been kind of adjusted, and now we're seeing that consequence of more sulfur deficiency.
So are we seeing it in one place more than other places, or is it how can we predict where we may see sulfur deficiencies?
If you're in an area of the United States that was getting a lot of free sulfur out of the air, and that's typically east of the Mississippi River, moving into places like Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan, and some of them where you had heavy industrial activity, a consequence was you got the free sulfur in the air. If you move out west where we don't have as much industrial activity, we had less sulfur in the air. So in these places where we've got a lot of high yields, high corn production, high soybean production, and alfalfa, so we're pulling a lot out of the soil, and we're also have decreased inputs. That's where we're starting to see these sulfur response trials really shine and show the advantage and the economic return on making that investment in sulfur fertilizer.
So, Karl, we've talked in previous episodes about why crops need sulfur and the importance, but let's take just a minute and remind our listeners again why these plants need the sulfur. What is it used for in the plants?
Yeah, lots of reasons. There's a reason why it's one of the macronutrients. You take a sulfur ion, and the plant uses it for a lot of different processes, including the construction of chlorophyll. I mentioned the symptoms of sulfur deficiency, the yellowing, and that's due to that decrease in the green pigmentation that comes from having enough chlorophyll. If you don't have enough chlorophyll, the plant will not be able to take the sunlight and turn it into useful biological energy. So once that plant goes yellow, you're kind of revving down that engine. You're gearing it down a little bit, and you won't be able to get as much work done. If you look at your nitrogen fertilizer program, sulfur is a key driver of your plant's nitrogen metabolism. So taking that fertilizer that's in your urea, UN32, you can list other nitrogen fertilizers if you want. but turning it into something more useful, and sulfur is a key part of that. Uh, if you're into eating, sulfur is one of your friends here. If you think about garlic and onions, just to name two crops, one of the reasons they taste the way they do is because of sulfur. The sulfur is driving the flavor. So if you've ever had a garlic ball that didn't taste quite right or wasn't quite strong enough, maybe check that sulfur nutrition program. Maybe call the grocery store, let them know. But you've also have in baking, breads, sourdough breads need sulfur as a part of their the baking process to make the bread. So really kind of going from that crop level all the way to what we experience in terms of our diets, you'll need sulfur the whole way through.
Carl, one thing we like to talk about a lot here on the dirt is the 4R nutrient stewardship program. How does sulfur fit in with the 4Rs? We want to talk about the right place, the right rate, the right time, and the right source. So, if you would talk a little bit about nutrient stewardship as it relates to sulfur.
Yeah, so sulfur, as we mentioned, the budget, we have that nutrient budget. Fewer inputs of the free sulfur and more extraction on the back end from yield. So you've got to meet those crop needs somehow. And what we found is that the soil supply is not often enough with these new hybrids that we have with new yield goals. So we've got to supplement, and that's where fertilizer comes into play. So the 4R nutrient management, the right time, the right place, the right rate, and the right source are keys for driving sulfur efficiency and getting the most out of your fertilizer investment. So one piece that you have to think about with sulfur is that the way that sulfur is often applied is in the sulfate form. Sulfate, so SO4 is the if you see those letters and numbers on a fertilizer bag, sulfate is the form the plants want and that they can take it up. But you have a hard time managing sulfate because it's prone to leaching, just like nitrate is. So we have this choice to make. Do I put out this readily available form of sulfur in a sulfate form? Think about products like calcium sulfate, magnesium sulfate. There's a whole bunch of sulfate products on the market. So you can provide that sulfate, but am I going to lose it to leaching? So you've got to think about the timing. If this in Texas where they just got 20 inches of rain, they're probably thinking about sulfate leaching. The other piece with sulfate, remember that's the form the plants want, is if your soils are too dry, that sulfate can't get into the crop. Just like nitrogen, most of your sulfate moves into the plant through the mass flow mechanism, going through that water stream through the soil into the plant. So if your soils dry down, you won't be able to pull the nutrient in. So you're kind of on dry and over wet. Sulfate can be hard to manage. So a way around that is to make another formulation choice, and that's what we spoke about at the Cultivate conference. You can go into what's called elemental sulfur. So when you apply elemental sulfur, that's where you can apply a form of sulfur that's fairly inactive in the soil, is not going to leach, but you need time on your side. One of the other 4R nutrient bullet points here, you need time. That elemental sulfur needs to be transformed by the soil microbes into sulfate before it can be taken up by the crop. So you've got some choices to make, I think, depending on your field, your weather conditions, whether it's over wet or too dry. You can think about how you want to deploy your sulfur formulations in a fertilizer program and make sure that you're hitting those 4R nutrient management tenements.
Yeah, and you kind of hinted on something there, Carl. You talked about the source and the timing. The timing may be altered depending on the source. If we're using elemental sulfur, we need to make sure we get that out maybe sometimes several months early. And if we're using sulfate, we need to get it applied when the crop's actually going to be taking it up. So
that's right. Yeah. So the elemental sulfur needs time. You need to have time on your side because the microbes in your soil are the middlemen. So they need to work on that elemental sulfur and oxidate it into the sulfate form that the plant can pull in. So if you want to apply in the fall, it's a great time to get your elemental sulfur out and make sure that it's ready for the spring when your crop needs it. The sulfate form, because it's so highly leachable, putting it out in the fall well in advance of planting, probably not a good idea. You'll lose it to fall rain or fall snow, and then snow melt and when the weather warms up. So you're better off putting that out closer to when the crop's growing and maybe even in season in a side dress.
Well, Carl, another thing that we spend quite a bit of time doing is digging into the literature and looking at new research reports. And you were just telling me before we started recording this about a new study that you had seen that came out here recently. You want to talk a little bit about that research?
Yeah, great set of studies out of Purdue recently testing sulfur on corn, and we've got that linked on our Nutrien Economics website if you'd like to take a look at it. But taking a look at where does sulfur respond in across Indiana soils, and how does corn yield respond, and what conditions drive a sulfur response. And so what these researchers noticed is that they studied I think 55 sites, and out of those 55 sites, 47% or so responded to a sulfur fertilizer application. So not every site responds the same, kind of like what we're used to with nitrogen and P and K to a lesser degree. So 47 sites responded, and when they did respond, the average bushel an acre increase was 11 averaged 11 bushels an acre. So it was a big, like a home run. Like when you hit the home run, that's when you got it. So really interesting work, just showing that identifying on your field, identifying, do I need the sulfur, is a great place to start, so that when you do make that investment, you can have a high likelihood of getting that yield increase and solving a crop nutrition issue.
Right, and that's what it's all about. We want to make sure we have that probability of getting that result. Carl, you mentioned 47 of those sites responded. Now, Indiana, that's going to be. We typically think about good, rich soils, high organic matter soils. When I think about Indiana, where I'm from, and probably where you are as well, we don't have that blessing of organic matter. So we don't have the organic matter to be releasing this sulfur. If they did that same study in your area or my area, do you think that probability of seeing that response would increase because of the lack of organic matter?
Yeah, you see a lot of sulfur issues on that low end of the organic matter sort of range, and of course Indiana's range is a little bit higher than Mississippi and Arizona's, but that's right. That organic matter in the study, they claim that 100 pounds of organic sulfur for every 1% of soil organic matter on your test. So that's kind of a general rule of thumb: 100 pounds of organic sulfur for every 1% SOM. So Mike, where you and I are from, where we're barely scratching in at a 0.5%, there you go. 50 pounds. Thanks. But in some of these areas where they've got 3, 4, 5%, they've got something to work with. I mentioned that the microbes earlier. These microbes are also crucial for converting the sulfur in the organic matter into something that's plant available. And it's thought that only 2 to 6 pounds is freed up by those microbes from that organic fraction. So you can see our pool to work with in the low organic matter soils just got even smaller. So you got to make up for it with the fertilizer program, because the 200 bushel an acre corn needs about 10 to 25 pounds of sulfate an acre. So we know there's a tremendous need. We know some of our soils can't keep up, and that's where that looking at where are my fields going to respond, and that's where finding the fields low organic matter, high sand content, maybe big reduction in the sulfur inputs over the years because of the Clean Air Act. Lots of extraction of sulfur. So maybe silage corn versus grain corn. You've got some different sulfur extractions coming out of the soil, with silage taking everything. At least with grain corn, you're leaving the stover behind. And then, places I think where you've noticed symptoms before, that you have a great season ahead of you in your truck, keep those notes. Where are you seeing the yellowing of the tops of the plant? So that when you have that opportunity to either fertilize, maybe side dress this year, you can come in and see that response yourself, or make that different plan. If the symptoms show up too late relative to your fertilizer logistics, you can come in next year.
And Carl, I recently heard a podcast that Dr. Ron Heiniger out of North Carolina State had done, and he was talking about some early season symptoms of sulfur deficiency, and he encouraged growers to make sure you plant that corn more than 1.5 inches deep. He had some research that showed if you got it below 1.5 inches, a lot of times you could pick up more sulfur and that corn plant would do great. If that seed was planted at 1 inch or less, the probability of seeing that sulfur deficiency was a lot greater. Have you seen anything like that before?
That makes total sense, because sulfate can move. So you're moving that seed into where the sulfate's at, down lower in the soil profile, and there's more moisture down there generally. So you have that mass flow mechanism where the sulfate can get into the actual plant. So you're kind of leveraging the two different mechanisms that control sulfur. And we've seen some issues with sulfur deficiency, on some of these very shallow seeded crops, these lettuces and things like that, where you're barely scratching them in the ground, and you are prone to some of those issues with seeding depth. So yeah, that research sounds spot on.
Well, listeners, if you've been tuning in for very long, you know that now's the time that we start talking about our famous person in agriculture. Now, this week, I've decided that we will talk about John Franz. Now, John was born in Springfield, Illinois. He spent his entire career working for Monsanto Company. He focused his research on process research, new polymer synthesis, and the development of polymer flame retardants. Early in his career, he actually received 2 patents, one for nitrates in 1960 and another for a fire retardant in 1967. In 1967, he transferred over to the agriculture division of Monsanto because he was excited about their emphasis on publishing, about academic contacts, and the freedom to pursue new ideas. The research that was going on at Monsanto at the time was searching for a new herbicide that was going to be effective against annual and perennial weeds, and they had been working on this for about 9 years and had very limited success. Franz began working on this, and after a few false leads, he was able to discover a herbicide named glyphosate in 1970, and I'm sure everybody has heard of Roundup these days, but he was able to get the patent for Roundup. Monsanto took that patent and paid him for it. He got the grand sum of $5 for the patent on Roundup. Seems like he gave that away to him, but he went on and worked for Monsanto for the rest of his career. He published over 40 scientific papers and wrote a book entitled Glyphosate, a Unique Global Herbicide. But he focused his research after that on some auxin chemistry, cell membrane chemistry, plant hormone chemistry, and nitrite and sulfide chemistry. In 1975, he was promoted to senior science fellow, and in 1980, he was promoted to distinguished fellow within Monsanto, and he finally retired in 1991. Now, in 2007, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, and one of the quotes from his speech at that induction ceremony was that was in recognition of the entire team of scientists who worked on and supported the development of Roundup herbicide. Now, I understand there's a lot of pros and cons going around about Roundup now, but I think farmers all can see the benefit from his developments there at his time at Monsanto. So, listeners, we want to really thank you for tuning in again this week. Without you, we wouldn't be able to do this, and we hope we're bringing you timely research-based information. If there's a topic that we haven't picked up on that you want to hear more about, please let us know about that. And as always, if you need more information, please check out our website. That's nutrien-economics.com. And until next time, this has been Mike Howell with The Dirt.